Well, good morning. You may have a seat. My name is Jill, and I am the children's pastor here at Commonway. So this is just a little bit of a different vantage point than what I usually have. We're usually up playing games and running around the room at this time. So this is just a little bit different, but I'm really glad to be able to be up here. Oh, and I even have a good helper. This is my middle son right here. So thank you. Well, I love summer. One of my fondest memories growing up was spending time out on the boat. My parents have always had a boat, and we lived about 10 minutes from Salamone Reservoir, so we were out on the water whenever we could be there. I grew up learning how to tube and kneeboard and ski, but skiing was by far my favorite. And I think it was because I had the most control over where I was going. I had a love-hate relationship with tubing because I really loved tubing, but I don't know if you ever rode with somebody like a dad like I have. His one and only goal was to see how dramatic he could get you thrown off the tube. So that was my experience. So like I said, I loved it, but I also hated it. And the reason that I hated it is because I hated being left out in the water while I waited for the boat to come back and get me. Because I have a severe and irrational fear of fish. Oh, I have a serious, I was sure that those fish were going to come and attack me somehow. I don't know. I've heard it said, that fish are more afraid of you than you are of them, but I really am not sure that that is quite true for me. I don't really know even where that fear came from because I've never had a negative encounter with a fish. Like a fish has never even come and nibbled on my toes because I've never given it the chance. But I think it maybe came from sometimes fishing. When we were younger, we would get to spend a week by ourselves with our grandparents. And my grandma and grandpa lived at Lake Barbee, and it was just the most wonderful time to get to go up there and just have my two-on-one time with my grandparents. My grandpa loved to fish, and I loved my grandpa, so he would take me out on the boat. And for the longest time while I was younger, all I had to do was cast the line, and I could reel it in, and I was really good at that, and I did not mind anything with that. But one day, and I was probably 4th or 5th grade, we went out very early in the morning, and my grandpa decided I was old enough to take the fish off the hook. So, yes, Steve. So I remember that day as clear as if it was yesterday. It was a beautiful, still morning, and we were the first ones out on the lake. There was still, it was just idyllic. And so we went out there, and I remember just casting the line a few times, and I got one, and I reeled it in. And Grandpa was like, "You're going to take the fish off." "Oh, no, Grandpa, that's not how this works." And he was like, "Oh, no, if you can cast it out there, you can take it off." And so I think everyone on the lake woke up that morning at that time because my grandma could hear me on the other side of the lake. We were on the opposite side from where she was. So she could hear me that morning. So I'm certain that everyone on the lake woke up to my screams of protest and adamant. I was being adamant. I was not taking that scary bluegill off the hook. So my grandpa and I were both pretty stubborn. I was definitely not taking that off, and he was not going to let me not do it. But in the end, I want you to know that I won because I think my grandpa had more mercy on that fish than he did. Grandpa, that was the last time I ever went fishing with my grandpa. He found other ways to connect with me after that, and he had other grandchildren that did like to go fishing, so he just decided to take them. But I can still hear him asking me that summer morning, "What are you afraid of?" You see, we have so many different reasons that we hold on to fear. Sometimes it's because we let our imaginations go, and we can imagine the very worst case scenario for whatever's going on in our lives. We hear about something, some situation, and our minds go automatically to the worst possible thing that could happen, and then that fear consumes us. I can easily let my mind get there if I let it. Many fears people have are a result of something that's happened to them in their past. Oftentimes, people are triggered or reminded of a traumatic event that reinforces or resurfaces an old fear. Their minds can go to that place in an instant when something is triggered inside of them. Another reason that people have fears is that they don't want to be exposed for something they're hiding. They're either blinded by their sin or some kind of weakness in their lives, and they just don't want that to be exposed to others. Whatever the reasons may be, fear can play a big part of our lives. It's probably one of the reasons that fear not is mentioned 365 times in the Bible. Nothing is hidden from God. He knows every one of our fears. When we are wrapped up and consumed by our fears, though, our joy and our peace are lost or stolen. You see, but Jesus came for our freedom, for life, to restore us. Jesus said this, and he was acting as the good shepherd in this, and he said that the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. But I have come that they might have life and have it to the full. It's from John 10:10. Today I'm going to be taking you through a little bit longer of a passage from the Bible than what we normally go through. It spans over a couple chapters of the book of Mark. And within these chapters, we're going to look at the disciples' fears and how Jesus responds to those. There are some very rich connections that I'd like to make, which is why I'm going to go through a little bit of a longer passage, because these stories are often divided into two parts. I recently heard Danielle Strickland share a message over this scripture, and it resonated so deeply with me that I really wanted to share some of what I learned with you. You see, Jesus, he spent a lot of his time teaching on the west side of the lake, or the Sea of Galilee. It's referred to in different ways throughout the scriptures. Here you'll see a picture of the Sea of Galilee, and you'll see some different familiar places like Capernaum, and over here is where a lot of the story of our Bibles take place. He'd been drawing huge crowds and presenting parables, and he left the crowds in awe and wanting more. At this point in Jesus' ministry, everyone was just really drawn to him and wanted to see more of what he had. No one was really kind of like wanting to arrest him at this point. The sea was central to life for the people in this region. This whole region, though, was under Roman control. And so for the most part, the Jewish people lived over here on this side, up here and down here. And then over here on this side, these were more Roman and Greek camps. Let's see here. So after Jesus was finished teaching there, he had just finished teaching and the crowds were still trying to follow him, Jesus told his disciples, he said, we should all go to the other side of the lake. So our story was going to start in Mark 4, chapters 35 and 36. And he said, okay, it says here in verse 35, that day when evening came, he said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat, and there were also other boats with him. There's a lot that can come to the surface when we are prompted in our lives to go to the other side, especially when you might be moving into unfamiliar territory. I can imagine some of the things the disciples might have been thinking. Jesus, this ministry we have is going pretty well right here. And these are our people. We know everything about this land. This is really pretty comfortable right here. And Jesus, there's so much more work to be done right here where we are. Why would we want to go to the other side? And we don't know. Did the sky already look a little ominous? Did it look like there could have been a storm coming in? We don't know any of that. But I am quite certain if I was there, my mind would be racing through trying to weigh out some options. staying right here where I knew people, where it was safe, where people were liking Jesus and cheering for him and wanting to follow him, or going to the other side where I knew it was primarily Romans and there was unclean things over there, and I just didn't really know what to expect. I know which would have been my choice of what to do. I think that those things could have even crossed their mind. I don't even know that, but they could have crossed their mind. But nonetheless, the disciples got in the boat with Jesus. They had already seen too much and been too intrigued by what they've experienced with Jesus in the short time that they'd been with him. So they were compelled to continue to follow him. Too often, I think we all as a society, we have been invited to follow Jesus. And oftentimes we say no because of what it might cost. So let's see what happens next. In verse 37, it starts, "A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, don't you care if we drown?'" Have you ever heard the phrase, the peace that passes all understanding? That is what I think of when I think of Jesus in this image. I mean, he wasn't at all fazed by this storm that was popped up. I mean, actually, the words furious squall are used here to describe this chaos. I mean, water, I can only have that visual, water rushing over the sides of the boat, swamping it. Have you ever seen the TV show Deadliest Catch? It chronicles like Alaskan fishermen, and like if you just seeing those waves crash over the side of the boat is enough for me to be like that. That's too much for me. But I just have that image of the waves crashing over the side of the boat, and I can only imagine what those disciples were feeling. You know, even to this day, like in current day, on the coast of the Sea of Galilee, there are even signs that tell people not to park too close. So even if you're on land, you are at a great risk of having your car swamped with waves because of how violent the storms get there. So like this was just a big thing in this area. And the storms in the Sea of Galilee are strong and fierce. And even though everything and everyone was being tossed back and forth, Jesus was able to sleep on a cushion. Actually, this is the only mention in the whole New Testament of Jesus sleeping. Can't you imagine when the disciples went to wake him up from a journey they were already maybe a little uncertain of and said, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Can you hear the fear in their question? Can you just sit for a moment and imagine the fear racing through their minds? Many of these young men made their livelihoods on the water, so they were no strangers to how to handle a boat. Yet in this moment, they could see that this could be the possible end of their lives. The fishermen, more than most people, realized just how dire their situation was. And yet, somehow Jesus was able to sleep through it all. When we decide to go to the other side, things in our lives may not always be as neat and tidy as we had hoped. The disciples' lives were never smooth sailing after they chose to follow Jesus. But they chose to continue to follow him because they believed in who he was and what he taught. You might have found yourself asking, does Jesus even care about what's going on in my life? Perhaps you or a loved one might be facing something that seems just as defeating as a boat out in a furious storm. And from your vantage point, it might seem that all Jesus is doing for you is taking a nap. This is early enough in the disciples' relationship with Jesus. They didn't quite yet understand how much more than just a teacher Jesus was. going to continue here in verse 39, and it says, "So he got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, 'Quiet, be still.' And then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, 'Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?' They were terrified and asked each other, 'Who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him.'" It's in this moment that we see our key question for today that Jesus asked. Why are you so afraid? We see here that Jesus gets up and immediately calmed the storm. People. He commanded nature to still in an instant. Now, I can quiet a room of rowdy children with the best of them, and sometimes that feels quite miraculous. But I cannot even imagine what it would have been like to see Jesus quiet the wind and the waves. He turned to his disciples then and asked them why they were so afraid. At this point in the story, I can only imagine even more what the disciples were thinking. They'd had a very good reason to be afraid. What did he mean? Why are you so afraid? Their boat had just been beaten up, and they feared for their lives in this storm. And yet, even though they did have a very good reason to be afraid, Jesus asked them if they still had no faith. No, he hadn't moved in the way that they had expected him to move, or protected them in the way he thought that the Christ might, but he was showing them more and more about who he was and that he could be trusted, even when their world around them was in turmoil. Jesus genuinely wanted to know why they were afraid, even though he was right there with them. I don't know about you, but whenever I have felt that my life is in the middle of a storm, I have questioned that, does God even care? And if he did care, then whatever this hard thing, why wasn't it healed or fixed or solved? In fact, the more I look at this passage, the more I can relate with the disciples. God, I'm drowning here. Don't you care? However, God does care. He'd witnessed the disciples had witnessed the faithfulness of Jesus over and over again, and they weren't even done yet. They were just getting started at this point. The disciples were able to experience firsthand that this life of following Jesus was not going to be smooth sailing. It was, in fact, going to be very difficult at times. This was not the first, nor would it be the last time that they marveled at just how faithful Jesus was to his word. You've seen, and I'm sure you'll continue to see as we go on throughout our series, that we humans have to be reminded over and over and over again. Jesus asks us questions repeatedly. He, above all else, was worthy of being trusted. Jesus had shown that he could be trusted then, and he was about to show them that he could be trusted still as they actually approached the other side of the lake. Now, what was waiting for them on the other side? Another exposure to another kind of fear. So we're going back to our map here and seeing that the eastern part of the Sea of Galilee has actually been very disputed over the last 2,000 years or so. It belonged to Syria for many years, and then it's been part of Israel since the War of 1967. And even in Jesus' day, it was disputed land. Now, after the death of Herod the Great, the land was divided, the eastern part of the land was divided into different portions, different people to be ruled over it, but it was never, ever a Jewish territory. The southern part was called the Decapolis, and that's because there were 10 cities. It literally means 10 towns. Again, we can understand why the disciples might have been a little hesitant to go to the other side of the lake. Well, we're going to go ahead and pick up in Mark chapter 5, right after Jesus had just calmed the storm for his disciples. Starting in verse 1, it says, "They went across the lake to the region of Gerasene. And when Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and he broke the irons his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. I would say this was probably a little scary, and it was definitely not on the disciples' fear travel itinerary bingo card. When we're going to keep going in verse 6, when he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran out and fell on his knees in front of them. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send him out of the area. So what was Jesus going to do? What was this reason that they'd been called to the other side? In verse 11, we see this start out. A large herd of pigs was feeding on a nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs. Allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. This is another reason that we know that the people living here were not Jewish. This was a herd of 2,000 pigs. Pigs were considered to be very unclean animals to the Jews, and they therefore would not have had anything to do with one of them, let alone 2,000 of them. We're going to continue here in verse 14. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and the countryside, and the people went out to see what happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. Of course, they were pleading with Jesus to leave the region. They had just witnessed somebody that they knew lose a herd of 2,000 pigs. This was a stark reminder, though, that Jesus wasn't the one. He didn't send those pigs into the sea. This is a reminder that evil, the evil one, Satan always comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And Jesus comes to be able to give us life. I want to continue here in verse 18. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And all the people were amazed. We often think we are at the end of this part of the story, but there are some amazing details here that Mark doesn't want us to miss. This man that Jesus set free is often referred to as the demon-possessed man. And just by a quick glance at the first few verses in chapter 5, we can see that this man was not living in freedom. Jesus humanized him. He saw his need, and he saw him in his suffering. He heard his cries from far away and chose to go meet him where he was. We see Jesus confronting and exposing the name of the oppressive power over this man when he asked for his name. God always calls out the names of the oppressors. Mark was setting up this very important point that was not lost on the disciples. When you look here again at verse 9, Jesus had just asked asked the demons what their name was, and he said, "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." Do you remember who I just told you was occupying this land? The Romans. The Romans were considered to be terrible oppressors of the Jewish people during their reign. Do you know what a group of Roman soldiers was called? A legion. A group that had been oppressing and terrorizing the Jewish people for all of Jesus' life. Roman legions had different symbols that kind of recognized them and helped them identify where they belonged and where they were stationed throughout their empire. Do you know what the symbol was for this particular group that was stationed in this area? A pig. Why does this matter? Why is this important? Make no mistake that Jesus was blowing the minds of his disciples in this moment. When Jesus gave permission to the legion to be released into the pigs, the fact that they, under the control of the enemy, ran off the cliff to their death, the disciples were giving a very parallel image of the freedom that not only this individual man experienced, but he was showing them that the freedom that they could have from their oppressor when they decided to fear God more than the Romans. Even when we can't see what is happening, God has such a bigger picture over all of it. The disciples had lived their entire lives under the control of the Roman rule. They had likely seen or even experienced firsthand some of the horrific deeds done in the name of the empire. So seeing a visual of the legion overtake an unclean animal to end in its death showed them just how more powerfully this man is that they had chosen to follow Jesus. To the Jews, the Romans represented the legion that possessed this man. They were oppressive, making the people that they oppressed to live in fear and under their complete control. The fact that this group's symbol was a pig was even more fitting because Jesus was showing them that he had come to break down every existing worldly power and system. Jesus came to bring life and freedom, whereas the enemy only came for destruction and death. Jesus exposed this for the disciples. And even if they weren't quite understanding of what this fully meant at that time, I'm sure that this was embedded in their memories, and it probably came up again and again and again as they continue to see exactly what Jesus has done throughout their time with him. So God's power is liberating. It gives. Worldly power takes, controls, and uses people. So Jesus calls us to go to the other side for our own liberation and restoration, but also for that of others as well. He cares so deeply about that. When Jesus told the liberated man, the once demon-possessed man, to go home, the man did not want that. He wanted to follow Jesus. But Jesus didn't come to deliver him for what he could do for Jesus. He came for restoration. So he sent him home to be reconnected with his family because that was the best thing for this man. He didn't want this man just to jump from one master, the legion, to another master, Jesus. Because if that happened, his family would not have recognized the difference between Jesus and his former master. But when his family was able to see what a miracle that had been done in their loved one's life, I know that their hearts were changed as well. Jesus knew that restoration was the very best thing for him, rather than just gaining another follower in his group of people that followed him. when we choose to go to the other side with Jesus, we are saying that we choose this liberating life, even when the journey brings unexpected storms in places that we never intended to travel. However, when we're able to realize that the fears that we often hold so tightly, that hold us back and kind of paralyze us, are the very things that blind us from seeing who Jesus is and the life that he brings, we are able to have greater freedom in our own lives. So Jesus invites us to go to the other side, to bring us things that we can't often anticipate, things that we can't see when we're asking Jesus, don't you care if I'm drowning? Going to the other side might bring feelings of discomfort, uncertainty, different assumptions, anxiety. But when we actually go to the other side that Jesus has invited us to go to, we can have restoration, freedom, clarity, peace, and so much more. I want to invite you to consider what it might mean to confront and name some of your fears and hold on to the hope and freedom that Jesus brings. So I ask you, why are you so afraid? I, like so many of you, maybe not, but I've had a lot of fears at different times regarding our transition to a new lead pastor. I thought I was not going to do this like I did last time. We've encountered a lot of change over the last year, haven't we? And sudden change is something I am not always good at. Some of the things I've been afraid of are listed here, but not limited to. Will we lose families during this change and transition? Will relationships be broken? Will I lose any more coworkers? How will my work dynamic change? How will this new person change a Sunday morning feel at this church? How will this new person change my day-to-day operation here at the office? When I heard Danielle Strickland talk about these scriptures back in April, I knew that God was speaking this to me. And I also want you to know, even though I'm crying, I have a lot of peace about this, and I don't have the fear that I did. As a member of the staff here at Commonway, and as well as being part of the search team, I have felt the weight of just how much this decision will impact not only my life, but the lives of everyone here. While I was reading through the words of Mark, I could feel Jesus just inviting me to go to the other side of the lake. I know that God has been with us this far, and I trust he's going to continue to be with us throughout each step of the process. Joining God on this journey is always going to be better than staying where we were in certainty, and I can feel a significant amount of peace come over that when I finally was able to hold on to that, and I know that it is well with my soul. I'm going to invite Tyler to come on up here, and he has a song. He has a song he's going to close with. But as he's coming up, I want to ask you again: why are you so afraid? Sometimes our fears are over immediate life and death situations, like the calming of the storm, and sometimes our fears are of what might be on the other side. However, journeying to the other side with Jesus will always be better than remaining in a place of fear and doubt.